Welcome to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast, addressing all aspects of the digital enterprise, inspiring connection without boundaries and creation without limits. Thank you for tuning in. Here are your hosts, Thom Singer and Craig Brown.
This is the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. This podcast addresses strategies to enable enterprise transformers and decision makers to understand how digital tools and techniques deliver superior results in the global competitive marketplace. My name is Thom Singer, and I have the honor to co-host this podcast every single week with Craig Brown. Craig is an industry veteran and former PLM leader at General Motors, and Craig stays really involved in the PLM community as an advisor and mentor. Every single week, Craig and I try to bring to this podcast interesting interviews and other ideas that are going to enhance the careers of all the listeners. Hey, Craig, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Tom. It's good to hear your voice.
Yeah, I am excited because today we are joined by one of the board members of the Digital Enterprise Society. In fact, he is the co-content trustee for the organization. So he's very involved with things like the podcast and events that we have and papers that come out, etc. And that is Scott Wertel. Hey, Scott, welcome to the show.
Hey, Tom. Nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So Scott was an engineer, and now he's in an engineering support role, helping people in the field do their job better. He helps everyone get past growth curves by using elegant implementation of technology. Now, when you need to fix things, he's the guy who helps you not look stupid in front of your customers. So, Scott, we're excited to talk to you today. Craig, take it away.
Well, Scott, one of the things that helps with elegant solutions, the journey of all these tools that we get and the computer revolution that we've all been a part of in these last few decades, there's a lot of solutions. And it's kind of like Frankenstein, that there's too many complicated solutions and they're not elegant at all. So one of the things we're about with the Digital Enterprise Society is user groups. And I thought it would be good today to talk from the content director's point of view. Why are user groups so important? And also, let's start with just your experience with user groups. So tell us about user groups and the Digital Enterprise Society and why they're important.
Sure, I can certainly do that. Actually, it goes along well. I was just thinking that my co-trustee, Mark, wrote a blog post on how PLM is people. And people honestly should be at the forefront of technology ever since, early days. If you remember, Craig, you're old enough, you may remember with me the COFES, Congress on the Future of Engineering Software. I actually stood up one time and made a point of going, all this automation is great, but at some point we need to start designing software to put people in the loop. Because we've been trying to automate and get people out of the loop, but there are some things that people are the best at.
And making decisions is one of those things, by the way.
Well, especially right. Decisions with limited information, which is basically every decision a business has to make. So incredibly important to do it and that type of thing. But how do you get the right people? How do you know the people? How do you get them trained? And that's where, honestly, user groups were great back in the day and why that's kind of coming up these days. We have generational issues on people that want to get together and meet stuff. We have technology issues, just, whether or not we do it virtually or in person. We also just have political issues where some organizations want to control content more and not let the users run around and speak freely what's going on because it might shine badly on their software. In my opinion, those are all the reasons why we need user groups.
For those of you listening, I would be aimed at any of you building tools and you want to control the messaging. The great thing about user groups is they share knowledge, they share insight, right? And in my experience, I didn't volunteer to be part of them, but I had a lead engineer who insisted that I join something called the Aerospace Working Group, which is still in existence. We're a car company, right? But I had an aero background, so it was interesting to be a part of that group. We were able to share difficulties we were having with the deployment of the tool technology. We never had that discussion with the vendor themselves, which was a little frustrating, right? You kind of like to say, whoa, what have you learned at other clients and how can you help us not have those mistakes? You can't have that kind of a discussion often. I mean, some of them are pretty good at that, but a lot of them don't want to share that. So where do you get that? Well, you go to somebody else that's like your company. size and characteristics and that. Well, even companies sometimes don't want to talk with each other for lots of reasons, including liability. But individual users, PLM leaders, the support people that you're now a part of, you have insights that other people need. And a few of us over the years learned to work with each other. And, I still have 2 of those relationships that continue, even though I'm less and less helpful, given that I don't work full time. So, yeah, so user groups are valuable. Can you share with us some insight? What makes them successful? What makes a user group successful?
This is something I've noticed, not just in the CAD and PLM space, but honestly, any industry society profession. I'm a member of ASME. I'm a member of NSPE. I was a member of AIAA. So all aerospace and engineering groups. And all of those used to have some sort of, local chapter meeting, something like that would go on that would be very equivalent to a user group in the PLM CAD space. And basically what ends up happening is you'll have the one person that's passionate and they will end up running it until they get burned out. And you'll have, a few people that get value out of it and will show up every time. And then you have the other people out there. So, other than I think, and I'll call them out by name, the one that was most successful and everybody knows is the SolidWorks User Group Network. That one is the biggest one still working today. And honestly, it came down because they had support from the parent company. They had someone from the parent company that championed it all around there and actually traveled to all the local in-person user group events to make them feel like they belonged and had value. They had local support either through resellers or something else, because nothing kills a user group more than somebody having to pay out of pocket to rent a meeting space or something like that, because no one's going to do that. And then, just the active participation of people sharing their knowledge. And if you don't have anybody that's out there willing to share knowledge, then that group's going to die regardless of anything else.
Well, I think that's a key attribute. So those of you that are involved in working groups, or you're thinking about being involved in working groups, be comfortable with public speaking and come up with your piece of it. And I learned this too, that the user groups work best when there's common interest, right? So a big one for large companies, which is one of the ones I'm part of, is deployment of the next version of the tools. And there's always challenges with deployment for lots of reasons. And by the way, the evolution of computing into cloud computing has even changed that whole game. It's actually made it easier in many cases. So I think common topics helps as well, common pain points, if you will. And this aerospace group that continues to meet, we used to have a rolling agenda, topic lists, and we would vote annually to say, okay, well, these are the topics for the next year, right? Now, user groups also work really well when they're personal, when they're face to face, and I really mean in the same room. Have things like the pandemic messed with user groups? Have they become less effective?
No, I think that the pandemic helped them.
Oh, interesting. Because they had time.
Obviously people weren't meeting in person during the pandemic. Mm-hmm. But user groups were dying off long before the pandemic, simply because people didn't want to take the time to go. And it's very generational. I'm going to use it. I'm going to use the word unprecedented times, right? Unrelated to the pandemic, this is the first time really in history we're talking about 5 different generations of humans still in the same workforce together. From baby boomers to Gen X to Gen Y to millennials and Gen Z are all in the workforce together now. And a lot of that has to do with retirement ages getting raised into the 70s as opposed to being 55 back in really, decades ago, right, and things like that. But it's really hard to get 5 different generations of people that communicate completely differently in the same room together, getting value out of what it is.
Interesting.
And I had this conversation actually with my 20-something-year-old work colleague, because she's the generation. She's like, why isn't everybody on Teams? Why isn't everybody sharing everything? Why isn't everybody chatting? I'm like, well, you're dealing with people that are in their upper 60s, low 70s, came from a work environment where you got promoted because you were the guy who knew the knowledge. So you didn't share the knowledge. So right there is the clash of what it is. And she also gave me the other perspective of going, well, I have a life. I don't work to live. So at the end of the day, I'm going to go home and do my life. If you want to have a user group meeting, have it in the workday because it's work related. Don't expect me to go after work and go. Because for them, it's work. It's not a social hour. Whereas even my generation and up, user groups were a social hour. It was networking, having fun, meeting people in the industry, and learning something at the same time.
Yeah, I'm that older generation, and it was better when we decided to meet somewhere in the country. It was always in the United States, and we purposely spent time. So the people and we hosted at our individual companies. So we were all big enough that we could, whichever company was a host, we had a place we could do it. So we didn't have to worry about paying for a venue. But getting people together also caused us to be, we were forced to congregate, if you will, right? And so we focused, right? I mean, we've got, if I was the host, I got visitors. I have to take care of the visitors, right? So the generational thing of, we have family, home, work balance things, but if we're making a trip for the purpose of the users group and it lasts 2 days long, chances are there's going to be a 16, 20-hour interaction period over those 2 days, including a meal and socializing. And, some of the best discussions occurred in the evening. Now, I realize that's a little different. Absolutely agree with Workday. If this is always an evening activity, like social clubs of decades ago, well, that's just not fair to raising a family. And it's not fair to individuals that could contribute, right? So I do agree it should be in the Workday. Are there other pitfalls? I mean, the generational thing is interesting. Everybody needs to keep an open mind. Hopefully we learned that in the pandemic. but I frankly don't have sometimes the patience to listen to what I consider some of the nonsense, which is probably what another generation thinks is fun to talk about, right?
Yeah.
I don't mean to offend them, but there is how do you get past that? I guess we all got to learn to listen to each other, right?
Yeah, open mind and listen.
I'm going to chime in on this because I know a little bit about, congregation and relationships and collaboration. And one of the things is that while it is true that people are like, I don't want to go to these meetings or whatever. I have a friend whose son recently was passed over for a promotion that was kind of, he thought, a given. And during the pandemic, he had relocated his family and they had said, you can live anywhere you want. And then the promotion went to somebody else. And he was upset. And they said, well, but the other person is here locally and participates inside the company and outside the company in events and things that were going on. So he's now moving his family back to where the company was because he realized that while it's great to be able to be remote, something happens when you get in the same room and people feel that they build that bond with you. So while it is true generational, I'm starting to see some younger people saying, well, I've got to do some of this in-person stuff because I have an ambition of going up the ladder. Do you see that as well, Scott?
I do. And that's what I'm saying. The pandemic actually helps because, humans are social creatures. Even the most highly introverted person like myself realizes that I need other human interaction. And whether I want to spend it talking CAD, PLM nerdery stuff or doing something else, that's the questionable part. But my career has gone the way it has gone simply because I did. I forced myself to get out of my introverted shell. I went and I socialized with people at events like this, made great contacts and networks that have honestly led to some of my career choices. So, and I do, I think a lot of the younger generation is finally starting to realize that. And then kind of to your point, Craig, that's the bridge that now brings us back together across generations, is we have something in common again, as opposed to just being completely different.
And you don't have to participate in every group that's out there, but finding 1, 2, or 3 organizations and things that you can really get involved with allows you to, over time, because meeting someone once doesn't make them part of your network. They don't even remember who you are later. It takes 7 to 10 plus interactions with people before you really start having that vibe of a connection with them. And so by just picking a few groups and saying, all right, whether I love this stuff or not, I'm going to get involved in this type of a users group or go to this type of a conference. Over a career, you start building those relationships that actually bring you that promotion, or it brings you that new job with another company and things like that. So I think it's always a thing when we start drawing lines on generations that we have to remember that some of these things are human. And we're always going to like people we've shared experiences with and get to know them better than someone who we have a like, a link, a share, or a follow with in a social media world.
Yeah, the bridging the generations. If you share an event or if you share an experience, then you build a bond, right? And I have my favorites over the years. I dealt with a guy from Southern California. I don't know if he's now retired, but he's a surfer. He loves surfing, right? And one day his VW van broke down, and I was driving with him, and I said, well, I got this GM car. It's called a Malibu. Surely it can handle a surfboard. And he was shocked that it handled 2 surfboards. So that shared experience, this guy, we talk maybe once a year, and we continue to remember that fondly, right? And it had nothing to do with our jobs. We happened to use the same tool vendors, and so we had a lot of practical experience to share with each other and how to move forward with PLM. One of the other things you mentioned, this connections for better opportunities, if I can settle it even further. User groups help that a lot, right? There's a lot of churn in our industries, but your skills are usable by very, very different kinds of companies. Once you know how to do virtual development with these tools, you're valuable to lots of different companies. And so user groups are a way to stay connected to that broader opportunity network. Interestingly, at the company I worked with for decades, that was one of the concerns about sending people to users groups, is that they would build out their network and they might get a better job. And so odd risk, right? If you're management of a company, which I was for a while, you sometimes are worried about that. My feedback internally always was, well, tough. If we aren't the best employer already, we should hear from them before they leave and understand what we need to do to make our company even better. And so that was a weird argument I used to have with some of the people that had the budget, right? Is, we can't send them to the users group because we might lose them. Well,
that's an argument that I hear from a lot of companies. Well, that's an argument I hear from a lot of companies, and it is, we don't want our people to be too engaged in the industries or they'll get plucked away. But the counterpiece to that is, if you hold your people back from, networking, building those connections, and thus gaining the knowledge and the social connections that help them solve problems, you're ending up not having the best possible employees. So there's other things you need to do for retention. Hiding your best people under a bushel is not the best way to let those people grow and bring the best work to your company. So that's my 2 cents to that.
And in my experience, they leave anyways, because they just realize that's not the kind of company they want to work for that has that kind of constraint. And in this labor market, they can leave. So,
and that's my response to those types of companies too, is like, if you're worried about people leaving because there's something better out there, that's a different problem than educating your people on what they're going to go to the user group for. So that one the way it's supposed to be tackled.
So we made it a little broader by talking about groups in general. Let's go back to user groups for a second. So when they started, or at least when I was young in my career, it was all about, wow, there's this new computer-based thing, and even computer-based was new. I'm old enough to have used a drafting board, believe it or not. And so, user really meant the tool user getting together in a group, right? So that's the name user group. How to use VisiCalc more successfully for those of you that use the first spreadsheet tool. So I think, do we still need user groups? In other words, learning how to use the technology better, or is it more about process groups and practice groups? I mean, maybe the term user group has outlived its usefulness. Scott, what do you think?
Well, I think the term user group has definitely expanded in scope as the world has changed, and that's some of the confusion on what really is. I mean, there's a lot of conferences now that are called user events, right? Because you invited a user to a conference, but really the conference is all about feeding them your pre-planned stuff. It's not about the users experimenting on their own. So if we go back to the day when it really was users sharing with other users in that event, I think that's one of the reasons why user groups haven't really sustained themselves, is because I can get content on the net on demand when I need it now. If I need to learn picks and clicks of software, it's available at my fingertips. I don't need to wait a month or 2 months or quarterly whenever this user group gets together to learn something new. So in that regard, user groups are obsolete. Then again, at the same time, the most common and most sought after topic of a user group is tips and tricks. No one ever complains about tips and tricks. If you show 10 tips and I only get one of them that's new to me, I just got value out of my time going.
So that's a problem with search. I want to say relevant search because there's so much content out there now. And frankly, some of it's pretty bad. You know, how to use a tool. And they talk for 15 minutes, but they don't tell you anything, right?
Well, and so this is something too that I think we've lost. And I won't, we started with generational things. I'm definitely not picking on a generation. I think society as a general has lost. Because I've known everybody, even my age and older, we scroll through content. We're just consumers, and we see an influencer, and we're easily malleable based on what it is. I think the one benefit of user groups, though, is it's implied peer review.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't get that with just plain online content. So the information you're getting has at least been validated by this small group of people that it's worthwhile, valuable, and something you can bank on.
Yeah,
I can't say the same
editorial
video that's 10 years old.
Yeah,
because I forgot to check the date when I looked at it. And
some of the videos, they can be old as long as their topic is still relevant. Which in things like fundamental physics, they're probably still relevant, right? But other topics are like, why are you drawing that fillet anymore when you could push the automatic button and it automatically draws it for you, right? Seriously, why even bother sketching anymore, right?
Yeah, so, when SaaS software has now got monthly updates and the feature you just did a video on is obsolete 28 days later, it's still hard to filter content online for stuff that's relevant, and user groups do that for you.
So I'm still thinking about a different term for them than user groups, but for instance, practice groups, right? The practice, it's like a group of professionals that practice a certain discipline. It's not a user of a tool. It's the people that practice mechanical engineering or whatever kind of engineering it is. And so I maybe that's part of the evolution is it's still important to get together. We've established that. It's still important to share insights. So speak up. But the insights might be not related so much to how to operate a computer. Almost everybody knows now because we grew up with them, right? But rather how to make a better product quicker, right? So that's a practice thing or a process thing. We've had a few guests that talk more and more about refining the practice of engineering, right? They don't use the word process. They don't use the word standard work. They use the word practice. And I think there's something to that. So maybe would we call it in trouble with practice group, then it sounds like you're practicing for a sporting event, right?
Like doctors that only practice.
Which is not quite what I meant.
I do real engineering. I don't practice engineering. I do real engineering.
Good point.
But honestly, that's why I like the term working groups now. I think so many of them come up with working groups because that's, again, what it's about, how to be more proficient and actually get practical work done.
Well, maybe that's the answer. We should be calling them working groups because that is what they do, right? It's usually relative to work. It's certainly relative to your own personal work habits, right? And things like that. So, well, Scott, bring this back to the Digital Enterprise Society. So what do we do for working groups, and how can people get involved?
Well, the Digital Enterprise Society is an agnostic group because we recognize the need of getting content out there for users to be able to easily compare what's available and not just get something that's from one straight vendor. And that's the benefit we bring. And example is in November, we have our user group coming up. So I would say start there, see if there's something there. And this is, again, going to be an eclectic group of users from Siemens, Dassault, Autodesk, PTC products, you name it. We're trying to bring in even all the startup PLM companies to get involved that you may have never even heard of before. And that's what we're looking at doing. And if this is successful, obviously we will expand it into a larger multi-day event. But in addition to that, go back into a little more regional groups too. So you don't have to quite travel so far, not quite as expensive, and build that network out with people in your local area.
When I left the PLM World Board as it became Digital Enterprise Society, we had, I think there was like a dozen working group meetings around the country. And so one of our goals was you never had to drive more than a day, right? And we just assumed people would drive rather than fly. Now, some of the regions, especially Middle West out, that's still difficult. But along the East Coast and the Midwest, that we had exactly that. There were working groups in Detroit, working groups in Indianapolis. There was a working group in Chicago. And for a while, we had one in Cincinnati, partly because that's where a lot of engineering is done. So, I think working groups are great. I think they should happen. And I think they happen when people stay involved. And so as we come out of this pandemic, everybody get involved. Find one that's interesting to you. I'm a car guy, so the car business is changing dramatically. Not having a car, but the way we propel the car. And there's a lot of cool engineering coming on. So stay tuned. And sustainability, in case you haven't followed it, I mean, we should have sustainability working groups. And what does it mean? Material choices, recyclability, all these other things become really important in our product decisions. So user groups or working groups can help with that. Tom, back to you.
Hey, this has been a great discussion. I hope everybody enjoyed this. Thank you so much for listening to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Learn more about what you've heard today at digitalenterprisesociety.org. We encourage you to leave us a comment in the show notes or on whatever your favorite app is where you get your podcast joy. And then join us again for our next discussion about organizational transformation through the use of digital tools and techniques. Be here every single week for more thoughts, ideas, and actionable information to help you navigate your career.
You've been listening to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Learn more about what you've heard here today at digitalenterprisesociety.org. Join us again next week for more connection without boundaries and creation without limits.